The day of departure arrived with a crisp northern dawn. A fleet of longships, more numerous and more formidable than any seen in a generation, filled the fjord of Vindheim. 2,000 men, the culmination of years of patient preparation, stood ready. They were not the wild, undisciplined horde that had followed the sons of Ragnar. This was an army, forged in the crucible of Erik Bjornsson's vision. Each man was equipped with a sword from Gunnar's forge, protected by a shield of Kaelin's design and inspired by the songs of Finn. They were a brotherhood, united by a common purpose, and they were about to unleash a storm on the shores of England. As the first rays of sunlight touched the dragon prows of the ships, a silence fell over the fjord. Erik stood on the deck of his flagship, the Sea Serpent, a vessel larger and more powerful than any other. He looked out at the faces of his men, a sea of hardened warriors, and he saw not the greed for plunder, but the quiet determination of men who were fighting for a future. He raised his hand, and a single horn blast echoed through the mountains. It was the signal. The journey was beginning. The crossing was a testament to the discipline and skill that Erik had instilled in his men. The fleet moved not as a scattered collection of ships, but as a single, cohesive unit. They sailed in formation, each ship maintaining its position, each captain following the precise instructions that had been drilled into them for months. They navigated by the sun and the stars, their knowledge of the sea lanes honed by generations of experience. But this was different. This was not a race to a target, but a strategic deployment of force. They were not raiders, they were an invasion force, and they moved with the deliberate, inexorable power of a glacier. The voyage took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of constant vigilance, of maintaining formation, of ensuring that no ship fell behind, that no man lost faith. The sea was unpredictable, the weather changeable, but Erik's fleet pressed on with unwavering determination. The men below deck, crammed into the narrow spaces between the oars and the cargo, sang songs to pass the time. The skalds who accompanied the fleet composed new verses, songs that would be sung throughout the Viking world, songs that would inspire future generations to follow in Erik's footsteps. They made landfall on the coast of Northumbria, not with the chaotic rush of a surprise attack, but with the calm, methodical precision of a planned landing. Scouts were sent ashore first, silent figures who slipped through the coastal forests, gathering intelligence, mapping the terrain. The main force followed, disembarking in disciplined companies, securing the beachhead, establishing a fortified camp. There was no shouting, no random acts of violence, no burning of farms. The local population, who had learned to fear the sight of a dragon prow on the horizon, watched in stunned silence. This was not the Viking way as they knew it. This was something new, something far more dangerous. Erik's strategy was not to terrorize, but to intimidate. He wanted the people of Northumbria to understand that a new power had arrived, a power that was not to be trifled with. He sent emissaries to the local lords, not with threats, but with a simple, stark choice: submit, and you will be treated with fairness and respect. Resist, and you will be crushed. He did not demand tribute in the form of gold and silver. He demanded loyalty. He was not here to raid, he was here to rule. Of course, not everyone was willing to bend the knee. A local thane, a man named Oswulf, who had made a name for himself fighting off smaller raiding parties, gathered his forces and prepared to make a stand. He saw Erik's army not as a new kind of power, but as just another band of pirates, and he was determined to send them back to the sea. He gathered his fyrd, a motley collection of farmers and fishermen, and marched to meet the Vikings. The battle, when it came, was short and brutal. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Oswulf's men, brave as they were no match for the disciplined shield wall of Erik's army. They charged with a great shout, a wave of bodies against a wall of shields. The wall held. It did not buckle, it did not break. And then it moved. The Vikings advanced, a slow, relentless tide of steel and death. They moved as one, their shields locked, their spears a forest of deadly points. Oswulf and his men were cut down, their courage no match for the cold, hard discipline of a professional army. Erik watched the battle from a nearby hill, his face impassive. He took no joy in the slaughter, but he understood its necessity. He had to show the people of Northumbria that resistance was futile. He had to break their will to fight, not with random acts of terror, but with a demonstration of overwhelming force. After the battle, he did something that shocked the local population even more than the battle itself. He ordered his men to bury the dead, both Viking and Saxon, with honor. He declared that Oswulf had been a brave man who had died defending his home and that he deserved the respect of a warrior. This act, more than any other, cemented Erik's reputation. He was not a barbarian. He was a king. He was a man who understood the laws of war, the importance of honor, the power of a gesture. The news of the battle and of Erik's actions afterward spread like wildfire through Northumbria. The other local lords, who had been wavering, now saw the writing on the wall. One by one they came to Erik's camp, not as defeated enemies but as new subjects, ready to pledge their loyalty to the man who had shown them that there was a new way, a Viking way, that was not just about taking, but about building. The integration of the new recruits into Erik's army was a gradual process, one that required patience and careful management. The veteran warriors, who had trained for years under Erik's command, initially viewed the local men with a mixture of skepticism and disdain. These were not warriors who had been forged in the fires of battle. These were farmers and fishermen, men who had never held an axe in anger, men who had never stood in a shield wall facing an enemy with murder in their eyes. But Erik understood the psychology of leadership. He knew that the veterans would eventually accept the new recruits if they saw them as part of a larger whole, as part of a shared mission. And so he mixed the recruits with the veterans, placing each new soldier alongside an experienced warrior. He created a mentoring system where the veterans were responsible for training and disciplining the new men. He made it clear that the success of the entire army depended on every man, whether veteran or recruit, doing his part. Slowly, over the course of the winter and spring, something remarkable happened. The new recruits began to transform. The farmers became soldiers. The fishermen became warriors. The fear that had been in their eyes when they first arrived was replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that mattered. And the veterans, watching this transformation, began to see the recruits not as outsiders, but as brothers in arms, as men who were willing to sacrifice everything for a shared vision. By the time the army was ready to march south, the distinction between veteran and recruit had largely disappeared. They were all soldiers now, all part of Erik's army, all committed to the mission of conquest and the building of a new Viking kingdom. The army had grown to over 3,000 strong, a force that was larger and more disciplined than any Viking army that had ever been assembled. The march south was also a logistical masterpiece. Erik had learned from the mistakes of previous Viking armies that had often suffered from supply shortages, from lack of coordination, from the chaos that came from moving large numbers of men across unfamiliar terrain. He had established a system of supply depots, stations where food and equipment could be stored and distributed. He had created a system of scouts and messengers that allowed him to maintain communication between the various units of his army. He had planned the route carefully, ensuring that his forces would have access to water, to pasture for the horses, to defensible positions if they needed to make camp. The local population watched in amazement as this army passed through their lands. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The soldiers were disciplined. They did not loot or burn. They paid for the supplies they needed. They were an army of occupation, not an army of raiders. And as the people watched, they began to understand that a new age was dawning, an age in which the Vikings were not just warriors, but builders, administrators, leaders who could create a functioning society. With Northumbria pacified, Erik turned his eyes to the south, to York, the city where he had fought his first great battle, the city that had been the capital of the Viking kingdom in England, the city that was now back in Saxon hands. It was time to go home. He gathered his army, now swelled by new recruits from the local population, and began the march south. 2,000 men had crossed the sea. They had not come to raid. They had come to reclaim what was theirs, and they would not be stopped. By the time the army reached the coast of Northumbria, it had grown even larger, swelled by local men who had joined the cause, by warriors from other Viking settlements who had heard of Erik's vision and wanted to be part of it. It was an army of conquest, and it was ready to change the world. The discipline that Erik had instilled in his men was evident in every aspect of their movement. They did not plunder the villages they passed through, nor did they terrorize the local population. Instead, they moved with a purpose, a focus, a sense of mission that was unprecedented in the Viking world. The supplies they needed were given, not taken, by a populace that had already accepted the new reality of Viking rule. This was not an army of raiders, it was the army of a king, and it moved with the solemnity of a royal procession. The local lords who had pledged their loyalty to Erik rode alongside the Viking warriors, their presence a symbol of the new order that was being established. The skalds who accompanied the army sang songs of conquest and glory, songs that would be carried across the Viking world, songs that would inspire new generations of warriors to follow in Erik's footsteps. As the army settled into its camps in Northumbria, the work of consolidation began in earnest. Erik established a system of governance that was designed to win the loyalty of the local population. He appointed local leaders to positions of authority, men who had proven their competence and their willingness to cooperate with the new Viking regime. He established markets where merchants could trade freely, encouraging commerce and the exchange of goods. He promoted the building of new settlements, the expansion of agriculture, the development of trade routes that would connect Northumbria with the wider Viking world. The transformation of Northumbria under Viking rule was remarkable. The kingdom, which had been fragmented and weakened by years of internal conflict and external threats, began to stabilize and prosper. Trade routes were established, connecting Northumbria with the Viking settlements in Scandinavia and with the wider Viking world. New settlements were built, new farms were established, new markets were created. The people of Northumbria, who had initially feared the Vikings, began to see them as potential partners in a new kind of society, a society where different peoples could live together, where commerce could flourish, where a new culture could be born. The discipline that characterized Erik's army was evident in every aspect of their movement through Northumbria. They did not plunder the villages they passed through, nor did they terrorize the local population. Instead, they moved with a purpose, a focus, a sense of mission that was unprecedented in the Viking world. The supplies they needed were given, not taken, by a populace that had already accepted the new reality of Viking rule. This was not an army of raiders. It was the army of a king, and it moved with the solemnity of a royal procession. The local lords who had pledged their loyalty to Erik rode alongside the Viking warriors, their presence a symbol of the new order that was being established. The skalds who accompanied the army sang songs of conquest and glory, songs that would be carried across the Viking world, songs that would inspire new generations of warriors to follow in Erik's footsteps. These songs would become legendary, told and retold in the great halls of Scandinavia for centuries to come. As the army settled into its camps in Northumbria, the work of consolidation began in earnest. Erik established a system of governance that was designed to win the loyalty of the local population. He appointed local leaders to positions of authority, men who had proven their competence and their willingness to cooperate with the new Viking regime. He established markets where merchants could trade freely, encouraging commerce and the exchange of goods. He promoted the building of new settlements, the expansion of agriculture, the development of trade routes that would connect Northumbria with the wider Viking world. The transformation of Northumbria under Viking rule was remarkable. The kingdom, which had been fragmented and weakened by years of internal conflict and external threats, began to stabilize and prosper. Trade routes were established, connecting Northumbria with the Viking settlements in Scandinavia and with the wider Viking world. New settlements were built, new farms were established, new markets were created. The people of Northumbria, who had initially feared the Vikings, began to see them as potential partners in a new kind of society, a society where different peoples could live together, where commerce could flourish, where a new culture could be born. This transformation would serve as a model for Erik's future conquests, a blueprint for how to turn military victory into lasting political and economic power. The establishment of a functioning Viking administration in Northumbria was one of Erik's greatest achievements. He created a system of governance that was both efficient and fair, a system that could serve as a model for future Viking conquests. He appointed administrators to oversee the collection of taxes, the maintenance of roads, the administration of justice. He established courts where disputes could be resolved fairly, where both Vikings and Saxons could seek justice. He created a legal code that was based on principles of fairness and reciprocal obligation. The cultural integration of Northumbria was equally important. Erik encouraged the building of new churches, the continuation of Christian worship, the preservation of Saxon cultural traditions. At the same time, he promoted Viking culture, Viking art, Viking craftsmanship. Slowly, a new kind of culture began to emerge, a culture that was neither purely Viking nor purely Saxon, but a blend of both. This cultural synthesis would become one of the defining characteristics of the new Viking kingdom. The military organization of Erik's forces in Northumbria was also remarkable. He established a system of fortified strongholds, towns, and castles that were connected by roads and supply lines. These strongholds served as military bases, administrative centers, and trading posts. They were symbols of Viking power and permanence, monuments to the new order that Erik was establishing. From these strongholds, Erik could project power across the entire region, could respond quickly to any threat, could maintain control over his vast new kingdom. By the time the army was ready to march south toward York, the transformation of Northumbria was well underway. The kingdom was no longer a collection of warring fiefdoms, but a unified state under Viking rule. The people of Northumbria, who had initially feared the Vikings, had begun to accept them, to see them as potential partners in a new kind of society. The stage was set for the next phase of Erik's conquest, the reclamation of York, the city that would become the heart of his new kingdom.